Hi everyone, this is Ashraf Hassanpour from Shiraz University of Medical Sciences, Anatomical Department. In today's lecture, we are going to be covering the structure of gray matter. True to its name, the gray matter of the spinal cord is distinguishable from the surrounding white matter by its grayish appearance. This grayish color is a result of the abundance of neuronal cell bodies in this area and relative lack of myelinated axons, which give the white matter its color. In addition to motor cell bodies, the gray matter also contains cell bodies of interneurons, as well as some unmyelinated axons and glial support cells. The gray matter has three main divisions of projections, and these are called horns. They are the anterior horn, the posterior horn, and the intermediate or lateral horn that pops up in the thoracic and sacral regions. And it might be easier to imagine them as three little communities in a gray matter village. What you find in all these communities are occasional axons, dendrites, and support cells. But what makes up the majority of gray matter are neuronal cell bodies. These cell bodies form little clusters of cells based on their functions, and these are called nuclei. There are nuclei present in each of the three horns or communities. So, you could probably imagine them as a little residence of that community, and the residents of each community are responsible for a different job. The anterior part of the spinal cord is responsible for motor function. So, if you want to, you could probably think of the ventral horn nuclei as workers who get told by the brain where to carry information. The posterior part is responsible for sensory function. So, in this case, you could perhaps imagine the nuclei in the dorsal horn as researchers, collecting information and sending it away to the brain to be processed. The intermediate horn is a little bit of a strange one. It's like a group from a different trip, the autonomic nervous system, that's been allowed to create a community in the gray matter village. It's mostly concerned with the sympathetic function, meaning our fight or flight involuntary response, and with the parasympathetic function of the autonomic nervous system, which means the resting involuntary functions on rest and digestive times. Just as a reminder, the somatic nervous system controls the voluntary movements and includes both afferent or sensory and efferent or motor functions, which receive their innervation from the anterior and posterior horns of the gray matter in the spinal cord. Alright then, so let's first travel to the anterior horn of the gray matter to meet the workers or motor nuclei, which take information the brain sends them and directs it to the appropriate parts of the body. The nuclei of the anterior horn are arranged into three groups, namely the medial group, the lateral group, and the central group. So the first group that we'll begin with is the medial group. The medial group is the one closest to the center, so it's a pretty easy one to remember. In addition, the medial group can also be further divided into ventromedial, so anterior, and dorsomedial or posterior parts. So, if you remember, we said that the anterior horn houses the worker's motor nuclei, and that is a specific area holds the cell bodies of nerves which innervate the muscle of the neck and trunk. This is important to know. All of these nuclei stretch the whole length of the spinal cord. The lateral group follows the exact same principle. So, the nuclei in this group can also be subdivided into a few different groups. The most anterior group is called the ventrolateral group, while the one posterior to it is called the dorsolateral group, and the last one is the retrodorsolateral group, which literally means behind the dorsolateral group, and that makes it the most posterior of the three groups. Unlike the medial group, the nuclei of the lateral group are only present in the cervical and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And if you remember, I mentioned cervical and lumbar enlargements of the spinal cord on the previous lecture. Well, the reason why they are present is because those regions of the spinal cord supply massive structures, the limbs. So, this is your big hint that the nuclei in the lateral group supply exactly these structures, the upper and the lower limb. There is something else that's quite neat about these nuclei. If you have a hard time remembering their functions, as we all do, you can easily work it out because the most medial part of the anterior horn supplies the most medial or axial structures, which are the trunk and the neck, and conversely, the most lateral or distal part supplies the most distal part of the body, which are the limbs. Of course, anatomy wouldn't be anatomy if it didn't complicate things just a little. And this is where the central group of the anterior horn sweep in. So the central group comprises two nuclei, and the first one is called the phrenic nucleus. It only extends from the C3 to C5 spinal segments and innervates the diaphragm. So you may already know the little poem to remember the roots of the phrenic nerve. Feel free to say it along with me. C3, 4 and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. Okay. The next one is the spinal nucleus of the accessory nerve. Again, this shouldn't be too difficult to remember. The spinal accessory nerve is a cranial nerve, so it's in the head. So, this nucleus is only present between C1 and C5 vertebral level, and it innervates the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. Okay, are you with me so far? I hope so, because we are about to visit the researchers in the posterior horn, which is the elongated part of the gray matter containing sensory nuclei. And we are going to start this journey from the apex and work our way towards the base of this column to meet the marginal nucleus, the substantia gelatinosa, the nucleus proprius, and the posterior thoracic nucleus. Starting at the apex of the posterior horn, the first nucleus we encounter is the marginal nucleus. You can see it in this enlarged area of a transverse section of the spinal cord, and the marginal nucleus is also often referred to as either the posteromedial nucleus or the marginal zone. It spans the whole length of the spinal cord, and its main functions are relaying information from pain and thermal stimuli, and some fibers of the spinal thalamic tract of the opposite side originate here too. So, as we travel away from the apex, we meet the marginal nucleus next door neighbor, the substantia gelatinosa. It's also referred to as gelatinous substance. The substantia gelatinosa has a similar job to the marginal nucleus and also stretches over the entire length of the spinal cord. If you follow its pathway into the brain, you'll see that it's continuous with the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, and it also modifies transmissions of sensory input. Deep to substantia gelatinosa lies our big boy, the nucleus peripheris. It contains second-order sensory neuron cell bodies which send out their central processes to form the lateral spinothalamic tract, and just like its neighbor, the nucleus peripheris extends the full length of the spinal cord. Deeper still lives the posterior thoracic nucleus, which is also known as the nucleus dorsalis, Clark's nucleus, and the column of Clark. Yeah, I know, anatomists really couldn't make up their minds on this one. It constitutes the base of the posterior horn, and it's a little bit different because it only stretches between C8 and L3. It receives proprioceptive feedback and it gives rise to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. And this region brings us to our foreign land, the lateral horn, which is quite different in its function to its neighbors. It is also known as the intermediate zone because it's squished between the two other horns. The lateral horn contains two discernible nuclei, the intermediolateral nucleus and the intermediomedial nucleus. The intermediolateral nucleus is the first one that we are going to be looking at. It only stretches between T1 and L2 and it gives rise to preganglionic sympathetic fibers. It leaves the spinal cord through the anterior nerve root and reaches the ganglia in the sympathetic chain through the wide rami communicants, forming the thoracolumbar outflow. A bit more medially lies the intermediomedial nucleus. It extends from S2 through to S4 and it gives rise to preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. These fibers then leave the spinal cord via the anterior roots of the spinal nerves and separates to form the pelvic splenic nerves. Okay, so we are finished with learning all the nuclei. There is just one more thing I want to talk about, which is another way to divide the gray matter into areas called the Rex laminae. They are named after Dr. Rex, who was a Swedish neuroscientist. He observed that the organization of the cells and fibers within the gray matter exhibits a defined pattern according to their structure and function, which allowed him to identify 10 layers known as the laminae. While most things in anatomy are named anteroposteriorly, this guy just had to be a little bit different and name the laminae starting from the posterior horn. So we are going to be starting by looking at the laminae 1 to 4 and describing their contents. So starting with lamina 1. Lamina 1 contains the marginal nucleus, and of course we already know this guy. We saw him located at the very tip of the posterior horn of gray matter. Lamina 2 in turn holds the substantia gelatinosa at the head of the dorsal horn, and the nucleus peripheris sites in lamina 3 and 4, which you can see here. Together, laminae 1 to 4 form the head of the posterior horn of the gray matter and are responsible for relaying mostly sensory information from the skin or exteroperceptive sensations. The neck of the posterior horn is formed by laminae 5 and it's formed by a variety of sensory efferent cell bodies and can become a center for pain. The base of posterior horn is formed by laminae 6, which deals with the sensory elements of the reflex arc of the fast pain. For example, moving your hand away when you accidentally touch a hot hub. It also gets pretty tricky here, as Clark's nucleus falls both under laminae 6 and 7, So next, let's look at the lamina 7. So this lamina also contains the elements of the intermediate horn, the intermedio-medial and intermedio-lateral nuclei. It has connections to the midbrain and cerebellum through white matter tracts, which are discussed in a separate lecture. And it also houses some Renshaw cells, which form a part of the negative feedback loop. Lamina 8 is a bit of a tricky one because it varies throughout the length of the spinal cord. For example, at its thoracic level, it takes up most of the ventral horn, but it's reduced to the medial parts at the cervical and lumbar enlargements. This lamina mostly contains interneurons connected to the fibers from different sources, which makes it into a sort of relay point where information is stored and passed on to the other appropriate neurons. Lamina 9 contains various clusters of cell bodies of alpha and smaller gamma neurons, which send information through their fibers to muscle spindles. And finally, lamina 10 is the no man's land, the area around the central canal. The function of neurons in lamina 10 still remains unknown. However, it has been established that this area plays a role in somatosensory integration, autonomic regulation, visceral nociception, and the modulation of the motor neuron output. The last thing I want to show you is how all these structures in the gray matter affects the shape and size of the cross-section of the spinal cord at different levels. The gray matter will vary in size depending on the structure it supplies. So if you think back to the nuclei we've learned today, you'll not be surprised that the gray matter is largest in the cervical and lumbar enlargements, where the lateral group of the anterior horn supplies the limbs. So now that we've talked through the layers of laminae, let's have a quick chat about some clinical notes that are relevant to this lecture. So, you've probably heard about poliomyelitis, which is more commonly known as just polio. Polio is a viral infection which can attack and destroy the anterior horn of the gray matter, which is called spinal polio. And from what we've learned today, we know that it houses nuclei responsible for motor function. Depending on the spinal level that is affected, polio can cause muscle weakness and paralysis, which is usually asymmetric. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. Happy studying.